Hi, it's Simon here from Analog Anorak, and today an introduction to a small independent classical record label that has really won the hearts of lots of audiophile classical music fans. This label was called Lyrita Records. At the time it was started in 1959, it was quite a pioneering label in that it filled a neglected niche in classical music, which was British composers from the first half of the 20th century. In the late 50s and early 60s, this music had got seriously out of fashion. It was hardly being played at all in concerts, and most of it was unavailable on records. First, it's important to give credit to the expert on Richard Itter and Lyrita Records, a musicologist called Lewis Foreman. In the description part of this video, I'll give links to various options if you want to find out more about this fascinating label. The story of Lyrita Records and its founder, Richard Itter, is far too long to do justice to in my video today. But what I wanted to do today is very much from an audiophile perspective, choosing details that I think will appeal most to people who tune into some of my videos. So I'm mainly going to focus in on the period where Richard Itter managed to start a collaboration with Decca Records, who had agreed to work with him, initially producing 5 albums to see how well things went artistically and commercially. As far as the big picture, Lyrita Records is a small independent label. So how did it become such an audiophile big hitter? Well, the first important factor is Richard Itter himself. This is a feature from Classical Records Quarterly that's got a brilliant summary of his life. Now, Richard Itter was basically one of us. He was a bona fide audiophile. He inherited his father's extensive classical record collection, which was mainly 78s, and built on this. He developed a love of classical music at an early age and also discovered that he was hopeless at playing music himself. He also discovered, fortunately, quite early on, that he didn't like being an accountant and instead set himself up as a semi-professional recording engineer. And it was from this tiny acorn that he managed to start a record label. He started small, but he was lucky in that he did have cash resources, and he managed to get built an extension to the family home of a small recording studio. He had also joined some of the professional associations, and he'd learnt a lot of tips and advice from other engineers, and he managed to make some contacts with some up-and-coming classical pianists to do some recording sessions with him acting as producer and engineer. The first record I want to show is an example of a really early Lyrita record. And they're not bad. They're not up to the mono standards of Decca recordings from a similar period, but he did a pretty good job. This recording, which is the first of a series doing his complete piano works with Alan Rowland's playing, it was so early on. He had learned about positioning microphones, but he wasn't yet adept at doing any of the fine editing. He had to insist that Alan Rowland keep playing the same piece, try his best to produce a completely perfect take, and when they were near enough, he then allowed Alan Rowland to move on to the next piece. It was almost like the days of 78s, even though he did have tape. Fortunately for Alan Rowland, as this series went by, Richard Itter did pick up some of the skills in editing, which made things a bit less stressful and time-consuming than this original session. But it wasn't just a competency issue. Richard Itter did have a preference for classical music recording in long takes, preferring spontaneity and continuity over perfection. This series of John Ireland recordings was one of the big sellers in the early days of Lyrita and did have an impact on the choice of artists and pieces when stereo became available. Richard Itter was very ambitious and wanted to make the step up so that Lyrita records could include large-scale orchestral compositions in stereo. He really knew his way around classical music recording. He was very keen for the stereo recordings to be as good as his favourite record label, which was Decca. So he decided to approach them, asking if they could take over the engineering, production and manufacturing of the stereo records. By this point, Lyrita Records had got a decent reputation, but Richard Itter also had a bit of luck on his side, that the person whose responsibility for Decca to decide whether they would collaborate with Lyrita was probably the most sympathetic person in the organisation, because it was John Coleshaw. And John Coleshaw and Richard Itter, they are so similar. At this time, a lot of the classical music producers came from a musician or conductor background, but there was a smaller number of really gifted, enthusiastic amateurs. Richard Itter knew what he wanted. He wanted Decca, he wanted Kingsway Hall, and if he was available, he also wanted Ken Wilkinson to be doing the engineering. And he pretty much got what he wanted, especially for the first 5 albums. Although this collaboration did turn out to be a big success, it wasn't possible for Decca to continue to offer access to Kingsway Hall, as it was just too popular and booked up. Fortunately, the high audiophile standards of this label did continue, but there is something special about these early stereo records, and that's because they're still just within the golden era of stereo recording, and they do have that classic Decca Kingsway sound in spades. In December 1965, over a 3-day period, the first Lyrita Decca collaboration recording session took place. Kenneth Wilkinson was available, and John Coleshaw had decided that David Harvey, a young and upcoming producer, should produce the session. Ultimately, David Harvey was almost exclusively involved with the Lyrita production duties over the first few years. The session produced enough material to actually fill 2 LPs, and it's these 2. Due to the success of the Mono John Ireland piano series, it was an obvious choice to start the stereo series with John Ireland. Now, these LPs do illustrate another bit of good fortune for Richard Itter, in that the conductor is Sir Adrian Boult. At this specific point in time, Adrian Boult's EMI contract had not been renewed, so he was more available to sign up to this project. Adrian Boult was the perfect conductor to have on board at this stage. He was basically the contemporary of these composers. He knew them and their works really well. He had also had a long-term relationship with the London Philharmonic Orchestra, which meant that many of the musicians were also familiar with these pieces. Another bit of good fortune was that Adrian Boult shared Richard Itter's views on doing long takes when recording. Of these 2 albums, the first one sold particularly well. Most of John Ireland's compositions do tend to be relatively short, so both of these albums contain quite a lot of compositions. This one in particular, though, includes 2 really catchy popular light pieces. The album opens with the London Overture. John Ireland lived much of his life in London, and this piece of music is very evocative of the sound and sights of the London which John Ireland knew, which is about 100 years ago. It's a very lively, jaunty piece, and is the sequel of the 3 London piano pieces that is featured on the mono record I showed earlier. The other really catchy piece is the Minuet from a Downland Suite. This is a great album for getting an overview of the orchestral works of John Ireland. The other LP is quite different in that it focuses more on another influence on John Ireland, which is much more related to his mystical side. He often visited places in Britain with pagan or Neolithic or mystical associations, and the atmosphere and aura and mystery of these places seemed to inspire his imagination and creative juices. One other thing about this album was that its production was partly funded by the John Ireland Society, a small group of enthusiasts. Richard Itter did find that these small societies of enthusiasts for a particular composer were very helpful in funding quite a few of the sessions that he did for Lyrita. So if you're interested in John Ireland's more mystical side, this is the album to go for. The next recording session took place at Kingsway Hall in January 1966. This LP features two lengthy works by Sir Arthur Bliss, Music for Strings and Meditation on a Theme by John Blow. It features a different orchestra, the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, and it seems only fair as the orchestra was responsible for the commission of the work Meditations. Stylistically, Sir Arthur Bliss is very different from John Ireland. Bliss tended to be more traditional, looking back to earlier English composers for inspiration. John Blow was an organist and composer from the Baroque period. Arthur Bliss came across his verse anthem to The Lord is My Shepherd, and he was inspired to write a larger piece, which then ends with the original composition by John Blow. It includes some pastoral elements, but also some much darker ones, and one of the strongest parts is Walk Through the Valley of the Shadow of Death. Arthur Bliss saw active service in France during World War I, and there's no doubt that the atmosphere and sounds that he conjures are inspired by the apocalyptic horror of those French fields. Hugo Rignold conducted the CBSO during an 8-year period. It was a relatively low profile time for the CBSO, in marked contrast to when Rignold was replaced by Fremo, and they were signed by EMI and produced some quite outstanding audiophile records. But they clearly seized this opportunity to make a recording, and although this album didn't particularly sell well and is a little bit harder to get, it's well worth getting for Meditations. Also, this is a historical recording, as this appears to be the single album made by the CBSO with Rignold over that 8-year period. For the fourth record, we go from Arthur Bliss to Vinyl Bliss, as this recording definitely has rock solid audiophile credentials. Kenneth Wilkinson was back at the controls at Kingsway Hall in March 1966. You probably can't tell from the handwriting there, but this album features compositions by Gustav Holst. As far as the more high-profile English composers from this movement, Lyrita tended to focus in on their less well-known works. His small-scale compositions for strings certainly sound nothing like the Planet Suite, but they are wonderful. It's a mixture of pieces. Some are almost proto-neoclassical in style, but there are also two folk music inspired suites written for pupils at the girls' school St Paul's, where Holst used to teach. The Brook Green and St Paul's suites incorporate folk music, and they are such vibrant, life-affirming pieces. For a while, one of his pupils at St Paul's was his own daughter, Imogen Holst, and she grew up to conduct the English Chamber Orchestra for this piece, and she was a marvellous choice for conductor for these pieces. The English Chamber Orchestra are on absolutely awesome form. A few years earlier, Imogen Holst had resigned from her post as assistant to Benjamin Britten, and she left this post as she wanted to devote the rest of her life popularising her father's works, and this was one of her most effective choices. If you're interested in Lyrita purely from an audiophile perspective, this album is a must-buy. Fortunately, it's sold by the shed load, so you don't need to fork out huge amounts to get hold of this absolutely wonderful piece. So we're at the final LP of the initial wave of Lyrita records, and this final one is a symphony. It's Bax's Symphony No. 6. Of these 5 recordings, this is definitely the one which you can really get your teeth into. It was recorded in July 1966 at a time where Bax's reputation as far as his symphonies was stone cold dead. This was in marked contrast to earlier on in the 20th century, where he was probably seen as the premier English symphonist. Unfortunately, as Vaughan Williams' reputation and impact increased, Bax's reputation diminished rapidly. At this time, Bax's reputation could simply be summarised as Mr Tintagel, because that was the only piece of music which was still being played. Lyrita ultimately did most of his symphonies and started the process of resurrection of Bax's reputation, and hopefully that process will continue over time. Arnold Bax had a very eventful, well-travelled life, and his musical influences were vast and complex. In some ways it's easier to go through what he was not inspired by, and in contrast to Holst and Vaughan Williams, you can certainly say he had no time for folk music at all. He wrote most of his symphonies relatively isolated during the winter on the northwest coast of Scotland, and that wild atmosphere and weather of that period permeates all of these symphonies. His influences included Celtic and Nordic elements, and I think overall, as far as his symphonies, the Nordic elements do come strongly through. And as far as trying to pigeonhole Bax, I would kind of say, if you like Sibelius, Bax is worth a try. The Sixth Symphony does cover 20th century issues, including beauty and nature versus violence and war. This Lyrita recording was made by the New Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Norman Delmar. Now, the New Philharmonic Orchestra was a later incarnation of the orchestra that played a lot of the seminal 50s EMI classical recordings. They had certainly less exposure to Bax's music compared with the London Philharmonic Orchestra, but Norman Delmar, despite being from a much younger generation than Adrian Boult, really loved this music and coaxes out of the New Philharmonic Orchestra an absolutely cracking performance. I love the beginning of this piece where Bax has composed this really heavy bass line, and considering the subject matter, could certainly be called a killer bass line. And the third movement is well known for its prolonged explosive nature. An audiophile element that I think also helps this LP stand out is, rather than Kenneth Wilkinson at the controls, two of the younger generation, Gordon Parry, who I've mentioned before, worked alongside James Locke, who actually came more from a rock and pop background. Most of the other Lyrita Bax symphonies were recorded by the London Philharmonic Orchestra, but this is really worth listening to. So after covering these 5 albums, there's just a few other things I want to mention. I think if you look behind at some other wonderful Lyrita recordings, as well as the audiophile qualities, there is a wonderful aesthetic for these album covers. As far as the album cover art, he used one artist who was actually his cousin's husband, Keith Hensby. So in addition to the audiophile quality of these recordings, there is this wonderful aesthetic of the covers, which means it's hard to stop collecting them once you get started. Itter continued to work with Decca until around 1979. He was very worried about the Polydor takeover of Decca and was not convinced that the quality would remain at such a high level. So from that point onwards, a small audiophile company called Nimbus took over the manufacturing of the records. The great news is Nimbus did a wonderful job, and I think I would struggle to tell the difference, blind testing, between Decca pressings and Nimbus pressings. After Nimbus, there was a period where EMI took over production of Lyrita records. They are a little bit hit and miss. Some of them are excellent, some not so much. From my own experience collecting Lyrita records, with the early 1970s Decca discs, which sound beautifully sweet, you do have to be a little bit careful inspecting for inner liner adhesion, which often can raise the sound floor. My advice is, if you're buying by mail order, the safest choice is Nimbus. But if you come across some cheap EMI pressings in the wild, get them, because the chances are they'll be fine. Richard Itter was also very sceptical about the quality of CDs, which significantly delayed Lyrita recordings going on to CD. Financially, this was a real problem for the record company, but from an audiophile perspective, it does mean that the quality of the CD transfers are fine. The main disappointment about the CD versions is that they haven't captured the aesthetic beauty of the covers, which is one of the top reasons why collecting Lyrita records can become a bit addictive. So I hope you've enjoyed this video about Lyrita records and maybe inspired one or two of you to have a try with them, because they are audiophile gold and they do really punch above their weight. Take care now. Bye.